look, you need an ecosystem that is controlled by the consumer. Because if you don't have it, the alternative is an ecosystem dominated by these walled gardens, run by guys like Zuckerberg, et cetera, et cetera. And like you as a consumer are 100% going to be left out in the cold.
You're listening to the Digital Data Café podcast, where we talk about everything data-driven in your world. Join us each week to hear from the world's top business and industry leaders on why using data in a digital world matters. Here's your host, Albert Thompson.
Good morning. This is Albert Thompson, your host from Digital Data Café, another great podcast. I'm here with the one and only CEO, Neil Sweeney from Reklaim. Neil, thank you so much for coming on. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. Well, Neil, I'm super excited. I mean, we've been chatting for a while, and I got to tell you, man, I'm really excited about Reklaim, what you guys are doing in the data space and how you're really solving that, one-to-one connective tissue. But before I get too far and ahead of myself, tell us a little bit about Reklaim and what's your role and what are you guys accomplishing over there?
Yeah, I mean, Reklaim has been around now for about 3 years. And it was created actually inside of my last company, a location attribution firm called Reklaim, which kind of just before COVID, we sold to Place IQ and then took our engineering team and started focusing really on what Reklaim's mission is. And I think, if anybody in your audience has spent any time in data and more specifically in location, they'll be well aware of a lot of the challenges regarding consent and data amalgamation or data capture. Yeah. And, I think sometimes like the location space tends to bear the brunt of a lot of the focus for regulators and the media. But, net, what we believed was that when GDPR, which is the European privacy law, came into effect, we really felt that was sort of a seminal moment, and that from this point moving forward, that data was always going to be different, and that we would incrementally move increasingly towards a world that would have more consumer inclusion and more consumer optionability. And I think, as you can also likely imagine, and your viewers can also understand, is that, whether you're in the digital space or not, everybody's a consumer and everybody has a data profile. So there's 7 billion consumers. Every single one of them has a data profile. It is that profile which powers the world. So, everybody's quick to talk about, data is the new oil, which is super cliche, but, really you're the free input. You're the input that is powering and generating billions of dollars of revenue, for a variety of different firms, ranging from Google to Facebook to, 6,000 different, data brokers. And what we sort of felt was that, why should the consumer have no transparency, no optionality, no compensation, et cetera? And so what we set out to do was, how do we create a royalty system for consumers where if and when their data is used by a platform, they are passively compensated? Now, you can be compensated in crypto, cash, gift cards, et cetera. I mean, that value prop will iterate and change over time. But really what we believed was, let's give consumers a seat at the table as it relates to the governance of their own data. We believe that the future of data and really business in general is going to have that from a consumer amalgamation point of view. So yeah, so that's what we've been working on for the last 3 years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, you're spot on, right? I think for the longest time, people have never really, truly, fully understood, right, the trade-off between their personal data and, the platforms out there that use it on a daily basis, right? And so I think more consumers are becoming aware of just how valuable that is and what that exchange looks like. And it sounds like you guys are really trying to solve that. But before we dive into exactly how you're solving all those big problems in the industry, everybody loves to hear the journey, right? I got to tell you, every time I do one of these podcasts, they're like, Albert, tell us the story of how did Neil get to be a CEO? How'd you get there? I'm sure it doesn't happen by accident. So what's your humble beginnings? How did you get from beginning to here?
Well, I'm a CEO and founder because I'm generally unhireable. I think. So I think that's. I don't think I have much choice.
That's fair.
Like,
Yeah.
who wants to deal with me? I'm a total pain in the ass. So I think like that's part of it.
Right.
Yeah, at the very beginning, I worked in I worked in big media. I spent a lot of time sort of educating senior executives on technology and the future and building like really elaborate, sexy business plans to acquire company A and invest in company B and so on and so forth. And everybody would nod and then never really take any of my advice. And then I think as I grew a little bit older,
Mhm.
I got tired of kind of pitching what I thought were good ideas that were never getting executed on. So I said, okay, let's not do this. Let's just go and do it yourself, and then kind of move that technology into the firms that I used to work for. So I mean, I've been doing this now for over 20 years. I've had a half a dozen of these different companies. This is the latest iteration. I think what's sort of unique to my journey a little bit is that I've worked in all aspects of media for sure, ranging from digital out of home to streaming audio to mobile DSPs to programmatic to data.
Mhm.
And I think what's interesting is that each of these companies is iterated and created in the company before it. So there's a bit of a Ukrainian doll sort of situation here that what we do is we invest in an idea, uh, we commercialize it, we scale it, and then because I'm inherently neurotic, I'm paranoid about the competition, and so I've always had this belief that I'm going to build the competition to my own business. And the intention there being is that I'm going to unseat this business versus letting somebody else do that for me. And so the way that that's worked is that as the larger business commercializes and scales and gets to a certain level, I tend to ladder that company into a bigger company through acquisition and then pick and roll and move on to the smaller company and rinse and repeat. So yeah, so that's really kind of been the journey. We've done everything from sort of the creation of in-stream ad replacement, which is now called, programmatic audio. That's still in existence. We were responsible for one of the first mobile DSPs that was never built. So we've been building a lot of, interesting tech over the years, really to solve problems, for this industry. And I think that's our sweet spot. We're clearly comfortable with the chaos and risk that comes with starting a new company, but I think we're pretty good at the ideation and commercialization of the next new idea.
Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting that you shared your background. My background's very similar, 20 plus years in the digital, MarTech, ad tech space, from programmatic as well. So I think there's probably some sort of like direct linear connection into what we see here in terms of data and direct marketers and modern marketers, and how they really are looking for the next level of how data really integrates into that. So it's probably something there that we could spend hours doing. But one of the things I'd like to ask you, and I think some of our audience would probably like to hear, and just obviously I'm neurotic like you, right? I always think about the competition, and it's really, I'm a big advocate of like, blitz scaling and Reid Hoffman's model, but, data collection had very humble beginnings. I mean, when we think of it, even Starbucks back in the day, right? They would literally write customers' information of favorite bean combinations written down on a filing cabinet. I think really what I'm trying to say here is that this isn't new, right? Understanding data and personalization and having that consumer connection isn't new, but Reklaim's really thinking about it in a new way, and would love to get your thoughts on, kind of explaining that connection and where you think it's going from here.
Yeah, I mean, I always get feisty when people kind of dismiss privacy, not because I'm, some over the top left leaning, individual that, wants to wear a tinfoil hat. I'm actually probably the furthest from that. Like, I'm a capitalist, like plain and simple.
Right.
But I'm also a realist. And I think, if you sort of step back from what's been happening in the space, everything is incrementally moving towards more regulation, loss of data signals, more consumer empowerment.
Yep.
And, I think this industry has a nasty tendency to, focus on the thing that's literally 6 inches in front of their face. And they have a tendency to miss sort of the bigger narrative. I mean, the most obvious being is this ridiculous conversation around cookie deprecation, which I think is probably the most dangerous conversation in ad tech, and it, typically misses the mark with a lot of people in this industry. The short answer there is it has nothing to do with cookie deprecation. Cookie deprecation is a byproduct of privacy regulation, which started in Europe, moved to California. And if you're a global company like Google, you benchmark your privacy policy against the most onerous,
That's right.
legislation.
That's right.
So, I think what people look for is, they're treating the sickness, but not the ailment, right? So they're kind of not getting to the root of it. And I think that's a real challenge in this space. And I think, I think the market is setting themselves up for a really big shock because I don't think people are really sort of understanding the larger forces that are kind of taking place sort of around privacy that, I think are inherently more disruptive. And, I've been on record for some time saying, look, we're moving entirely to a world of walled gardens. It's easy to sort of look at Facebook and Google. People always pick on Facebook and they're easy to pick on. But if you don't like Facebook and you don't like the terms and conditions of Facebook, then don't sign up. Google's a bit different because, Google has been providing signals and data to this market for a long time. And I'm of the opinion that Google is becoming a walled garden. And they are giving the industry a giant head fake around the cookie, because the reality is Google doesn't need and or use cookies. Cookies are for everybody but Google. So, I think, to your viewers, I would ask the question, how long do you think Google is going to continue to supply data to companies to build products to compete against them? It's not long. It's not long. So while everybody focuses on the cookie, what Google is doing is slowly but surely turning off the oxygen in the room, starving the industry of data signals, and literally turning the lights out on the open web, which, consists of 1.8 billion websites. So, if you don't like what's happening now, just wait till there's no oxygen in the room and the open web as you know it no longer exists. And now you are being dominated by a half a dozen walled gardens who don't give a shit about you or your data.
That's right.
Let's see how that goes, right? So, I think the whole philosophy around Reklaim is about, look, you need an ecosystem that is controlled by the consumer. Because if you don't have it, the alternative is an ecosystem dominated by these walled gardens, run by guys like Zuckerberg, et cetera, et cetera. And you as a consumer are 100% going to be left out in the cold.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And here's the interesting thing, right? So, and full transparency, right? With what we do from a first party perspective, I've also been on the record for saying, we've got to get to a world of, and I just thought, very beginning, right? Hashtag data independence. Because I think you're right. I mean, I think consent lives with the consumers. Today, it's very challenging, right, for marketers at all, to really be able to activate any type of data across the digital pathways, and really truly have that consumer-based consent, which is what's really exciting about what Reklaim's doing. But I think here's the other part of the thing, right? Consumers at the same time are realizing how valuable their data are, is. So they're becoming more privy to the invasive nature of the data that's being collected, how it's being deployed. They're calling for that to be changed. I think Cisco did a study a year or so ago that said 86% of consumers, actually say they care about privacy and they want to take more control. So I think consumers are slowly getting there, but to your point, you've got Google, right, slowly sucking that oxygen out. So, I mean, where does Reklaim fit into this, and how do you guys, plan to solve that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If you talk to any consumer at a cocktail party, I call, and you say, hey, your data is worth in aggregate $10,000 a year. It's a lean-in moment. Everybody's interested in that. There is an unhealthy relationship between consumers and their data. They're freaked out about it. They don't really understand it. They're worried that they're being spied on. I mean, these things are all kind of happening. Yep. There's a few things. You mentioned sort of the notion of consent. Part of the issue in the industry today is that consent is not interoperable. That's right. Why you as a consumer continue to get punched in the face with cookie notifications on each individual website. Why? because those websites, those platforms believe that that data is theirs, not yours. They believe that when you come to their destination, you as a consumer lose all right and title to your data. Nobody believes that as a consumer. No consumer agrees that that's how it should happen. In fact, it should be actually a license or a rental agreement where based on specific terms and conditions. So I think, this notion of, you could controlling or holding onto your data, forget it. Like that's not going to happen. But, I've been pretty vocal about this notion that, the inherent value of data is really based on its proximity to the user. It's why first-party data is more valuable than third-party data. So if you pin that data directly at the individual consumer, call that zero party if you want. Inherently, that means that it is higher fidelity, more consented, more compliant, so on and so forth. So like what I believe is that you as a consumer don't need to control the data, but you as a consumer should have a mechanism from which you can consent. And if you do that downstream, a lot of the challenges that you have in the space go away. So just think of it visually. Neil as a consumer takes his data, I send it out to 1,000 platforms. In the future, that needs to invert, and those 1,000 platforms should come to Neil and say, hey, Neil, can I use your data? That's a glorified bidirectional API, but that's exactly how it should be happening. So where does Reklaim fit into that? I think where we started was you as a consumer should be compensated for your data. That's primal and everybody agrees with that, but it's not that simple. That's why every firm that's tried to do this in the past has gone kind of belly up. What we believe is that first and foremost, Reklaim acts as a portal, meaning that you as a consumer can use Reklaim to, for the first time in your life, see the data that is actually in the market on you. That seems trivial, but nobody else is doing that. With transparency comes optionality. So now you can see your data. What do you want to do with it? What do you want to do with it, Neil? What do you want to do with it, Albert? You might want to do something different than me. That type of optionality doesn't exist in the marketplace today. And then thirdly, if you have transparency optionality, you can then have compensation. So what we believe is, sort of laddering those steps together. We believe Reklaim is manages consent or via an identity solution. And so I think when you look at Reklaim as to where it is and what it's becoming, we think Reklaim really starts to look increasingly more like an identity wallet, where the wallet in your pocket today has two primary functions: identity, secondly, compensation. Identity is a manifestation of data. So we have the data and we have a payment rail. And so if you have that sort of the tenets of a wallet, that's what I believe is sort of the baseline of Web3. And that's a larger conversation, but
for sure, right.
But this notion of Web3 does not exist without consumer control of data. Period. It does not exist. And so while everybody is like searching for an exact definition of Web3 in the perfect application, we believe that Reklaim is trying to build itself towards that, which is, let's create a destination, call it Reklaim. Let's assume it looks like a wallet. Inside of that wallet, you have a redemption rail and you have identity. And then inside of that wallet, what else do you have? Well, again, like the tenets of Web3 would suggest that you need payment. So maybe that's Bitcoin, but you also need a contract. That's probably Ethereum. And so with a wallet, with a contract, and with payment, now all of a sudden, you as the Wall Street Journal, or you as a data broker, or you as Equifax or TransUnion, if you actually want to use my data, you can query the identity, get it back, but then you can provide me with some type of compensation. That compensation does not have to be currency. It can be currency, it can be crypto, it can be access to a site, it can be a subsidy, it can be an NFT, it can be a lot of different things. But that's where I believe the market's going, and that's what we're building here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And I think, as more and more consumers have a better understanding of their data's value, I mean, it's just that value alignment, right? Actually, I think there's really two ways that I've looked at it, right? Eventually, it's one of two things are going to happen, right? Either no more tracking, which I don't think that's, or consumers are going to have to get rewarded for their data and take control. And I think, especially, generationally speaking, I think that plays into the whole exchange of it as well. Like, we've seen, Gen Z's responses to being more receptive to this value exchange around data. And at the end of the day, I think you're spot on, right? It does come down to that ownership and the control. And to your point, even though as trivial as it seems, that transparency piece is super critical, because that's the piece that aligns everything to make everyone happy. And that's what you really need in that exchange marketplace. So yeah, no, I definitely think that you are really revolutionizing the way the future is heading. So one of the things that, a lot of times people ask is, so what's the biggest challenges that you're facing in this? I mean, it can't just be, perfect and linear and just skyrocket trajectory. So what are some of the headwinds that you think Reklaim will face in accomplishing this, or challenges you've already faced?
There's a few. So I would say, as it relates to the ad tech industry, it's inertia for sure. People say, who's the competition? And I always say it's inertia, where the industry does not change unless they're literally on fire, right? So like we've seen this, and not to bring it back to the cookie, but everybody knows that the cookie is potentially going away. Mm-hmm. Are people really working on that? Not really. The moment it got delayed, everybody dropped that stuff, right? So I think inertia is by far the biggest, which is there needs to be a reason to change. There has to be a reason to change. And it can't just be because it's the right thing to do. There has to be, I have to do it. I think what's happening in the US is that, they've taken subsets of data, namely like ethnicity, sexuality, healthcare data, location data. That's all moved to an opt-in. So that's very similar to kind of the European world where, and I think that's a precursor for what's going to happen with the rest of the data. So they're slicing off, variables of data and requiring an opt-in. If you're a Fortune 500 brand or agency today, marketing in multicultural, how many of those are actually using first-party opted-in data? Zero. I can tell you that. Absolutely zero. They're all ingesting it from these headless data partners. There's no way, I'm of the opinion that the majority of Fortune 500 companies are running illegal campaigns on top of multicultural data targeting African Americans and Hispanics. Yep. Talk about being upside down on diversity and wokeness. It's crazy. But there are a handful of brands that are super progressive and a handful of agencies that are super progressive. But that's the type of thing where people are not seeing kind of the changes. They're not kind of keeping up with that. So that's one, is inertia. I would say sort of secondly is, this idea around compensation gets tricky because, inherently the consumer is greedy, right? So if you told the consumer that their data is worth approximately $10,000, they want $10,000. What they don't understand is that because they've never been included in the equation for data is inherently commoditized. And I always use the example of would you share your 24-hour, your 24-hour persistent location data for compensation? Some would say absolutely not. Some might say maybe, but it depends on the price. The price, for an individual's persistent location data is less than 1 penny per month. Yeah. No consumer would agree to that, but yet the entire location industry operates on that. So these are the two trains that are on a collision course, which is that the commoditization of data followed by sort of the requirement for opt-in will lead to a massive increase in the pricing of data, which you start benchmarking that against, traditional business models like in this industry, which operate historically on low margin, yep. You're going to be upside. So I would say, that the compensation one is a bit of an issue because people want to get paid a lot of money right away. And so you have to explain to them that it should be happening in the background as a fractional royalty. I don't think Justin Bieber complains that he's getting fractions of a penny because you're playing a song on Spotify, but the consumer is complaining because they're not making enough money from their data, right? So that's a challenge. And a lot of that is, behavioral economics and kind of how you sort of think through the value proposition. That's definitely a big one. Yep. So I would say kind of inertia, the fixation kind of on that. And, I'd say the last is that, there's a lot of businesses in this space that, don't really want things to change, right? So as a consequence, most big data firms don't really spend a lot of time educating consumers on, what's going on with privacy and their data, so on and so forth. I mean, there's good and bad to that. People say, well, why doesn't Facebook do that? I'm like, well, because Facebook does not want to tell 2.5 billion consumers that they're making, $50 a quarter off of their data, because there would be a coup inside of Facebook if that happened. So in one sense, it keeps those companies off to the side, but in another sense, it's part of the issue that it exacerbates the issue that kind of consumers have, specifically with their data. But I would just say, kind of in closing, if you look at last year versus this year, there are changes in the market that are forcing that. So I mentioned the ethnicity stuff in places like California and Virginia. You saw ATT from Apple. You are going to see some deprecation. You've seen, the deprecation of IP addresses, or those being designated as PII. You've seen Google kind of cut off, the scan phoning features. Like, you're seeing it happen. So when that stuff happens, it forces people back into the market to look for new partners.
Yeah. So, and we won't have enough time on this particular podcast to dive into these challenges, but I think that's probably a whole other show that I would love to consider doing with you, right? Is to dig into these headwinds and, how do we get the market, right, to really, get educated and understand that value prop exchange. And then, what do those collision courses look like from the data providers and these data companies? And it's just a lot more there to unpack than we'll have time, but I think that's spot on. So, well, then let's talk about this, because you did mention a second ago the successes that you've seen, right? You've seen a lot of people actually adopt and start to adapt. And basically in that hype cycle, I mean, how are you seeing that success? Are you seeing those successes? Are you seeing that adoption? Are you seeing consumers understand at Reklaim? And so what are some of the greatest accomplishments you've seen thus far?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that I'm proud of for sure is, we introduced the equivalent of a paycheck for consumers. We introduced that 3 years ago. We've never missed a payment on that. And so this one-to-many, where, again, let's just use a brand like UPS. UPS decides to buy data from an amalgamation of users at Reklaim, a fractional payment to, tens or hundreds of thousands of individual users from one brand. Like, that one-to-many kind of business model or royalty rail, I don't think exists really anywhere else. Not only does it not exist, it's consistent, and it's been happening every 3 years. So there's always parts of the product that, I'm always unhappy about, but increasingly I think, you might not like this, or you might not like this, but the one thing you can't debate is this part we've got tight. So I think, the introduction of what we refer to as Unveil, which is, the transparency around your data, I think that's a unique feature for individual consumers. Combining that with this, royalty system, or this payment rail, which has been fluid and consistent for 3+ years, I think that's pretty awesome. The fact that we're expanding now, again, internationally, sort of speaks to the larger vision of, look, we want Reklaim to be in the hands of every consumer in the world. So expanding out of the US is a big one. And then I'd say, on the B2B side of the business, what's been good has been, increasingly more and more brands are using Reklaim as opposed to, their historical partner. Now, some of them are doing that because the historical partner is now no longer compliant. And I would say, the companies that are best at that would be, the pharmaceutical, healthcare companies, multicultural companies, etc. But we've been managed kind of month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year to continue to build the business, return clients, add new clients, expand internationally. These are all things that, we're excited about. The other thing too is, I mentioned this idea that, everybody has a data profile. The percentage of individuals, I think it's like 89% of consumers in the United States can come into Reklaim and find their data. I think that's pretty awesome too. Yeah. So there's a few things that, I think as we've been on this journey for a while, I think I can point to as these are really cool things. We think they're super progressive, never been done before. And when combined together, they provide, something pretty different and pretty interesting.
So I know we're coming up here to the end of the show. So just to make sure, for the audience that's listening, walk us through just, if I'm out here listening, and let's say I'm a CMO of a national brand, and I want to make sure that, I'm identity authentication. I need to make sure that's crucial for my online, whatever, e-commerce business. Tell me why I should be looking at Reklaim and how will you make an impact in my business today? And then if I'm a consumer and I'm listening to this and, why should I, look at Reklaim as a potential way to, really build that value exchange between myself and your organization. And if there's anything that I'm missing, feel free to fill in the gaps, but, this is an opportunity for you to share to the audience, why Reklaim, is an opportunity to partner with.
Well, and I think for kind of brands and agencies who inform media through the equivalent of audiences, whether they're individual audiences or contextual audiences, what we provide here as a compliant seed that then can be used in both programmatic and in social. So you have a first party or zero party compliant seed that can then be modeled and implemented into your platform to actually inform your media. Some people might say, who cares? And I'm like, well, you should, because the value of the data that you're using is really only as good as the input. So not dissimilar to when you're making a cake. If you put better ingredients in, the cake's going to taste better. So, I think our pitch on that is, we can provide this type of data to these individual CMOs and brands. Complementing that is, look, if you have a multicultural line, you're trying to target sexuality, you're trying to target healthcare, you're trying to target, these new verticals of data that require an opt-in. And I would tell every CMO that you should know what SPI stands for. That is your job. So you should absolutely know that. And then you should be asking the questions of like, wait a minute, if we are running, multicultural item or line item, who are we working with? And do we have a path to consent? I think that's been a really big growing part of our business. So healthcare multicultural has been really, valuable to us. We combine data with premium inventory as well with publishers. So you can go end to end. So that's on the B2B side. For companies like, guys like yourself or others, we provide a consent solution or an augmentation solution where maybe you have a mobile ID or an email address, but you don't have things like age and gender. We do the equivalent of a match test and we pass back the additional attributes so you can have more breadth to the data that you have to supplement your existing first party strategy, but also underpin the data with increasingly more consent. So that's sort of what we do on the B2B side. On the B2C side, you as a consumer, I'd just say, look, go to Reklaim, download the application, validate who you are, and look, for the first time in your life, we're going to show you what data is circulating out in the market on you. We give you the tools to pick and choose what you like. We give you the tools to pick and choose the orders that you'd like to participate in. If you'd like to revoke access or consent, or you'd like to delete your profile or obtain your data, all of those hooks are already built into the product. So we think it's pretty progressive. We would encourage everybody to give it a go.
Yeah, well, Neil, I will vouch for that. I am a Reklaim user, so I have been in the app. It's fantastic. The UI, the UX is great, and it really does help the consumers understand exactly the value of their data and what you guys are doing. So, thank you again for the opportunity to chat today. Super exciting, and congrats.
Thanks again for having me.